Jesus, 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 sweetest name I know, fills my every longing, keeps me singing as I go. Marshall, you might get the lights. I'll turn these down up here too. All right, so anyone know what that word is to the right of Israel?
Israel.
Israel? You remember? All right. It's fitting it's over on that side too, because there were a couple times, thank you. You guys okay with that? Does that work for you? All right, hopefully you can see it really well that way, and hopefully you can't see me very well. Oh, yeah. He's a little darker, Marshall. So every once in a while we'd be at a location, and I was trying to look at like the placards to describe things, and it just didn't make sense. And then I realized, oh yeah, they start from right to left. And so if you go read it backwards, then it made sense. And so they would start, every time there was something in Hebrew, it looks off because it starts on the right side. But this is right, the country of Israel. And last time we were up in here, I believe it was, right, with Mount Carmel or Carmel and Megiddo. And today we're going to be around the Dead Sea. So I thought I'd start off with the Dead Sea. And I almost had to come up with another name, because as soon as you see I was in the David Dead Sea Resort and Spa, you know I wasn't suffering, and I really want to be, I like sympathy. But I was not suffering. So this is my view from my 16th story window over the mountains in the background, which is just, it's in the middle of the Judean desert, and it is desert. I've been to Florida in the summer. I've been to Texas, New Mexico on a Greyhound. That was probably hotter. You remember that? But this was, the breeze was hot. It's just a different kind of heat down there. But you can just barely see, I'll show some more pictures here, but just see some Dead Sea right there. But this is it's a resort area. In fact, it's receded so much they're having to pump water into this area to keep it going. And you drive along the banks and you can see other resorts that are all closed down because the water has receded so much that you don't want to go to a Dead Sea resort and then have to bus to the Dead Sea. So this is how they've kind of remedied the problem in some ways. So one of the things that was kind of interesting to me along the way, there's not a whole lot that was growing there, but these are date palms. So dates grow on palms, and this is actually where what God was referencing when he told the people of Israel that the land would be flowing with milk and honey. Okay? It would be flowing with milk from the sheep, the goats. Okay, so a lot of herds there, but also the honey is not honeycomb, but actually date honey. And I still have yet to try ours. It's still an unopened package, but we have some date honey at home. I got that. But the date palms grow really well there. A lot of different palm trees grow well, but the date palms especially. In fact, Israel exports 60% of the dates for the whole Gulf region. So it's a very important part of their economy as well, as an agricultural part of it. So, but looking at again from my window and kind of spanning over to the Dead Sea area, let's see, one night, you see this blue area right here? That's a shopping mall. We went down and walked down there. There's just a bunch of little shops, and you could buy Dead Sea mud for, to do like mud masks, and all these minerals. It's a big thing. You had to watch though, because when we were in this hotel, and they have your complimentary soaps and everything, and Dead Sea minerals, you can look on the back, made in China. And we're at the Dead Sea, and we can't even get something from here. But this is inside. There were, the spa was all downstairs. There was a waterfall there, and it was really pretty cool. But this is me proving my feet actually do float, but I have to get to 33% salinity in the water to get to that point. But this is what was underneath, what you're walking on. And if you were here the Sunday I got back, I had that. I had them in the back. You could look at it. But just my sunglasses there, kind of for comparison. This was balls of salt all on the floor. You know, I thought I've been to some areas where the sand was a little bit, you know, too full of shells to be really comfortable. It's going to feel great from now on because it was truly painful to walk out there. I hadn't thought to bring any sandals or anything, but that's what's on the bottom. But just everywhere around, they have these rails every once in a while because you can get down in the water fine, but a lot of times people have trouble getting up because you're floating. And you're not just floating, you're floating on top. Like you're floating pretty high. So trying to sit back up without just tipping over is kind of comical. So they would have these handrails around, but you can just see how salty that whole area is. That's all just salt on that handrail. This is some of the shore. I was trying to get a sunrise picture, and it was so hazy there that I don't think you're gonna very often get it. But those are all that's all piles of salt. You know, some of it's brown here for the dirt, but that's all just salt in this shore. That's not rocks or coral or anything. It's all salt in the Dead Sea. It's the lowest point on Earth, 1,400 feet below sea level. So here later, maybe next week, we're going to see Masada and the fortress up on the cliff. You had to climb up to sea level. And then you're up on this huge cliff and you're only about 120 feet above sea level when you're at the very top. It's really kind of strange. But I told you it was, the water's receding because it's, without fresh water flowing into it, it's evaporating, that's part of it, but desalination too. It's hot here, like I said, so I looked last night, so it would have been 2 a.m. when I was there, when I looked, and it was 91 degrees at 2 a.m., but just about, I don't remember exactly, I'm gonna say 40 miles or so to Jerusalem, but you go up to Jerusalem, and it was 78 degrees in just that span. So that's, like from here to Columbus, there's a, 12 degree, 13 degree temperature shift, just because of the region, the desert around this, and the height, the breeze, and everything. But it's been losing water since 1917. It's actually 33% smaller than it was in the 1960s. The Jordan River's not flowing quite like it was before. They're desalinating water, so they're taking water from this and the Mediterranean, pulling the salt out so they can use it as fresh water. But that's just reducing the amount of water here. And also, as the water recedes, so this is the picture I showed you this morning, but can you see this little line right down here? Okay, that's an old road, okay? Or that's a road, they don't use it very much now, but that used to be underwater. So it's receded that much. But what that also does is it means all of this, you can see the white is not just white sand, it's actually salt, a mixture of salt and dirt. But they'll have these deposits of salt, but what happens when flash floods come and fresh water runs into these areas of salt? What's it going to do to the salt? It's going to dissolve it. And then you're left with holes, so they have sinkholes everywhere. You don't want to walk out there, because they'll just randomly, sinkholes will just drop. And the fresh water will run into those sinkholes then, and then underground, and it never really fills up the Dead Sea like it used to. So it's quite a problem for them, and makes for an interesting landscape here. But this is, as I mentioned this morning, it's called the Dead Sea. Yes, because nothing can live in it, but also because if it takes but doesn't give, is how our tour guide described it. And I thought that was a great way to describe someone else, if we know people like that who just are always takers and not givers. And you look at them and you can describe them as kind of dead. And you and I get that way too. But that was the Dead Sea. So here is the Dead Sea, and we're going to hit two spots real close to here. So this is the first spot. This is called Gedi. So the first one, if anyone has an electronic, you have an electronic device, why don't you, honey? Why don't you look that up? And I want you to look that up. I didn't tell you what to look up yet. Ezekiel, which is not the place maybe you thought I was going to go. Ezekiel 47:10. Okay, so this is a prophecy. Ezekiel is full of prophecy, right? And about the millennium, in fact. And if you can read that for us, honey, Ezekiel 47:10.
And it shall come to pass that the fishers shall stand upon it from En-Gedi even unto En-Eglam. They shall be a place to spread forth nets. Their fish shall be according to their kinds, as the fish of the great sea, exceeding many.
So, if you heard what they're going to do, what are they going to do at En-Gedi? And then going to the other place that I'm not going to try to pronounce. It's up around that pin that I dropped on the map. So this is En-Gedi, all the way up there. Did you catch what they're going to do?
Fish.
They're going to fish. What does not live in the Dead Sea? Fish. Okay, because they would just die, right? It's too salty. But what he's saying, the millennium, there's this river that's going to flow from the throne of God, from the temple in Jerusalem, and it's going to purify everything, even the Dead Sea, to where they will be fishing. They'll be casting their nets from En-Gedi all the way north, all the way to the Dead Sea. So that was one reference to En-Gedi, and I'll show you some pictures of that here. Actually, I think we'll go ahead and do that now. So this is the beautiful location of En-Gedi. Now, if you can kind of tell, does this look a little similar to when I was up in the hotel, if you remember, and looking at those cliffs on the right? It's similar because it's similar. Right? This is the same kind of, if you would call it, coastline of the Dead Sea. So we're north from where I was staying, probably 15, 20 minutes. But this is the slopes of the cliffs, and then it flattens out to where the Dead Sea is and then was. And this is the location of En-Gedi. So when we're going to find out that David was at En-Gedi, he was, who knows, maybe he took a break from his sheep and floated in the Dead Sea too. I don't know. But this is the area. So this just kind of gives you an idea of what it looks like. It's very dry, very barren. I don't know how long you could last out here if you got lost. Thinking of trying to raise sheep in this area, I think I would have picked somewhere else. Right? Not super, not a very lush, I guess you could say. This is looking towards now, so the Dead Sea would be behind you. You're looking towards the cliffs of En-Gedi, and this is starting to walk back to. En-Gedi is actually a spring. It's a natural, it's an oasis because of the spring here coming out from these mountains. But Ain, so if you saw, it's not E-N Gedi, but they will call it E-I-N, Ain Gedi. Ain means spring. Gedi means wild goat, or a kid, like a baby goat. So the spring of the goats is basically what En-Gedi means. And all the way back to 4500 BC, there was a temple there. And this has been, if you look at the landscape, and then if you find water, it's no wonder there's going to be something there at that water from a long time back. So during the Second Temple period, in fact, there was a factory above here for glass too. But this is where they were going. So this is, the Dead Sea is behind us, maybe half a mile, maybe. You could walk there pretty easily, not too long. And this fountain right here is the spring of En-Gedi. Now, this is important because we need to go to 1 Samuel 23. Okay, I'm going to try to go there as well. But in 1 Samuel 23, we read about En-Gedi. And David and Saul have a little interaction there. David is running from Saul at this point, at the end of 1 Samuel 23. And he had kind of got a brief reprieve because Saul had to go after the Philistines, if you can kind of jump into the middle of that story. And so, verse 28, wherefore Saul returned from pursuing after David and went against the Philistines. And then verse 29, and David went up from thence and dwelt in the strongholds at En-Gedi. So, the strongholds at En-Gedi, is it any wonder you could have a pretty impenetrable fortress up here? You wouldn't even have to build it, it's kind of built in. And this is where David went. So then chapter 24, so Saul got the Philistines taken care of, And his mind is always on David. If you remember how much he hated David. And so he's going to chase after him again. In chapter 24 of 1 Samuel, it came to pass when Saul was returned from following the Philistines, that it was told him, saying, behold, David is in the wilderness of Gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel, and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats. Remember what Gedi means? And he was come to the sheepcotes by the way, where was a cave. One of the things you're going to see when we get to Jerusalem is you're going to see the field of the shepherds. And they weren't keeping the sheep out on the fields all night. They would take them out and let them graze, but at night they would bring them into a cave. It was much easier to protect them if all you have to do is guard one entrance. So the same thing would happen here. David, when he was taking his sheep, not at this time, but earlier, when he would have his sheep out, he would take them to pasture, and then he would find a cave for them, if he could, take them into the cave, and then all he had to do was stand guard at the cave door. Well, here, he says, in 1 Samuel, he came to the sheepcotes by the way, where was a cave, and Saul ran in to cover his feet. In other words, he had to relieve himself. Okay? So, David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. Now, can you see a couple of caves up there? They're not saying any one of them is, but there are just caves all through this whole region. Now, any one of them could be, this big, could be cabinets, could be anything. In one of these caves up here, David and his men were hiding. Saul came in, and then verse 4 of 1 Samuel 24, the men of David said unto him, behold, the day which the Lord said unto thee, behold, I will deliver the enemy into thy hand, and thou mayest do to him as it seemed good to thee. Then David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privily. So, if you remember this story at all, he doesn't kill him like his men are telling him to, right? This could have been his chance. But instead, he just kind of cuts the corner off of Saul's robe. Okay? It's called if I remember right, it's called something like the canaf. Okay, it's the corner of that garment. Have you ever thought this next verse strange? Verse 5, if you remember it, and it came to pass afterward that David's heart smote him because he had cut off Saul's skirt. And that always kind of seems strange to me. Like, what's the big deal? Why are you feeling bad about this? You didn't kill him. You should be patting yourself on the back. Well, one of the things that our guide was telling us is that corner of that canaf for Saul and that garment, it meant royalty. It was kind of that, it meant something to them, and it was symbolic of his position. So when David cut that corner off, he was doing more than saying, hey, I was close enough, I could have killed you. He was in fact saying to Saul, Saul, you're done. This is my throne. He was actually claiming that by kind of degrading Saul in that sense, or shaming him by cutting that off. So this is why David actually felt bad about doing that, where before I thought, man, you should be proud of yourself for restraint. But he didn't have to kill him. He was basically saying, I'm taking your throne from you. And that's why he felt bad about it. Verse 6, he said unto his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, stretch forth mine hand against him, saying he is the anointed of the Lord. So David stayed his servants with these words, suffered them not to rise against Saul. But Saul rose out of the cave and went on his way. David also rose afterward and went out of the cave and cried unto Saul, saying, my Lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed himself. This all happened at this spot on these rocks by this water. I think that's amazing. And it's no wonder, too, that Saul would have had such a hard time. 3,000 men, it wouldn't have mattered how many. You could have 30,000 men. And David would have had the upper hand in this situation. For one, the size of your army in this case could probably work against you, right? Trying to get any number of them up to any of those spots. And not only that, Bethlehem was only about 20 miles from here. So, any one of these caves, this is looking, the spring was down here to your left, look at this picture, and this is all along there. See the other caves? Perhaps it was one like that he was in. So today after we left Masada, We drove about 15 minutes or so and we got here. This is in Gedi. And if you can look around, it's pretty barren and rocky everywhere. Up behind me you can see some caves. And this is an oasis here. It's an underground spring that comes out. And this is where David hid away from Saul. And this is also where David cut the kanaf, or the corner of Saul's garment, off. And this is where David would have written probably Psalm 42 and Psalm 104. And you read about the conies, you read about the deer panting for the water. This is where it was, where he wrote it from, and where he would have been thinking about. This is only about a day's walk from Bethlehem, so probably he actually had his sheep here before, which is why he would have known the area so much better than Saul would have, and could have gotten in and out unnoticed. But this is the spring of En-Gedi, and quite a stark change from the rock everywhere else around us. So that could have supported how many sheep? I mean, and only 20 miles from Bethlehem, he would take his flock, and they would be gone for days, and they would go for miles. So it's very, in fact, probable that David had his sheep here, and this was his backyard before even he was having to run from Saul. Maybe that's why he chose this spot to come and hide. So there's Bethlehem, upper left corner, and that's En-Gedi by the Dead Sea. You can kind of see the change in topography. It's because that's that mountain range that you would have to be climbing down to get to En-Gedi. But remember, En-Gedi is just right at the Dead Sea, basically, so it's 1,400 feet below sea level. Anything else is uphill to Bethlehem, where David was from. These are what David writes about in Psalm 42, as the hart panteth after the water brook, so my soul panteth after thee, O God. The hart is referencing the deer, and these would have been the deer. They were actually, we pulled up into En-Gedi, and there was this flock of wild ibex. That's what these are. It was walking out. And I know there's a fence behind it, but that's not because it's a zoo. I didn't cheat. These are wild, and these ibex are a certain kind of, this ibex has to have a drink of water. Other kinds of deer in the area, they can get their moisture, their water intake from the plants they eat, but ibex can't. It's not enough for them. They have to go to the spring to take a drink. So David is saying, I can't just get by. I have to have, it's essential to my life to come to the water brooks, or to pant after you, God. I need a drink from your living water. This is what David was saying. So as he's writing that psalm, then it's a good possibility, he's thinking of maybe even this location with these ibex coming in and out. This is, they're called a hyrax right now. I should have thought ahead and just brought one of these back for my kids. I wouldn't have to get any other things, would I? Would this have worked, Bree? Yeah? Naya, do you think we could have handled one of these in our neighborhood? That'd be all right? You guys wouldn't even notice with all your animals. Your parents wouldn't even notice. This is called a hyrax, or in Psalm 104, David calls it a coney. So let me read that real quickly here too. In Psalm 104, he's mentioning all the things that God has done and provided. And let's see. Verse 18, the hills are a refuge for the wild goats. Well, we just saw those, right? And the rocks for the conies. This is a coney. And right above the spring, directly above the spring, these conies were hiding in the rocks. The rocks were their refuge, just as David wrote about, and he probably pictured this very spot as he's thinking, well, these conies were just sprawled out everywhere. It was pretty neat to be able to see Psalm 104 in real life, as we saw in Gedi. So there are a couple things that came to light then, a little bit more from En-Gedi. But there's one other point I want to take you to, and that's called St. George's Observation Point. So if you can see up here we're northwest of the Dead Sea. Jericho's really close there. And this is on the way there. I thought I'd throw that in there too. Every once in a while, this is a Bedouin community. So you still see the Bedouins walking. This is a very meager living, but this is how this group of people is living. You would see these around. We were on top of this hill, and I told you there was 13-degree temperature shift, and that was at night. So I don't know how things would have changed. It was pretty similar when we were there too. So we're getting closer to, we're on top of the hills and going over the hill too, like to Jericho. And it was very windy, as you can tell from my hair, but I don't know if you can, how well you can see that right down here is a monastery, right, in this ravine. This was built where some believe Elijah was fed by the ravens. Now, they were wrong, and I don't know who had to explain that to their superior, but this is not the location. If you look at the directions that are mentioned where Elijah was and where compared to Jericho he was when he was fed by the ravens, this would not be the place. But this is still an active monastery. It's a Greek Orthodox monastery. If I read it right, there's only one guy living there now. But for some of the guys, I mean, that's ideal, you know. That's, I'm not saying anything. I don't know how close we are to Greek Orthodox, but I might have to find out. But it was built in, I think, around 420 AD, so just a little under 400 years after Christ. And this is on the original highway from Jerusalem to Jericho, right? I need someone else to, or you guys, that's fine, someone to read Luke 10. Start reading in verse 25, right? Are you able to do that again, huh?
Yeah, first I just want to repeat the
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, read nice and loud. That'd be great. Luke 10, 25, and then we'll see how far I make you read, okay? But remember, this was the original highway, and if you can kind of see, it's not going to be a 4-lane highway, but this was the way. It didn't need it to be a 4-lane. This was the way between Jericho and Jerusalem. So go ahead and read nice and loud Luke 10, starting verse 25.
And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? He said unto him, What is written in the law? How readest thou? And answering said, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. And he said unto him, Thou hast answered right. This do, and thou shalt live. But he willing to justify himself, said unto Jesus, And who is my neighbor? And Jesus answering said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and fell among thieves, which stripped him of raiment, and wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. And by chance there came down a certain priest the way, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. And likewise a Levite, when he was at the place, came and looked on him, and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion on him, and went to him, and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast.
Thank you, buddy. That's great. Did you catch what story? Remember our old hospital, right, in Zanesville was the Samaritan Hospital, right? It was from this story, the Good Samaritan, did you catch where that man was traveling? Between what two cities? Jerusalem and Jericho. I'm not saying this was the exact spot, but this is the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. And this is what everyone who heard Jesus talk about, this man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho and then being attacked, this is the road that they would have known where he was traveling. This is the way he had taken. That's where that parable is, the setting of that parable. But not only that, we also need to go to, I told you this was going to be kind of Daniel-centric here today. And a very familiar psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth my soul. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me, thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." I know there's more to that chapter, but this path, right in this section here, this is called the valley of the shadow of death. This is what this road is called. And it's called that because the sun never reaches the path down the bottom. It's always dark. And so as you heard about from the parable of the Good Samaritan, that also can mean that there's a lot of places you can tell to hide and for thieves to attack as you're going through. But the valley of shadow of death was always dark. And as David's writing Psalm 23, he's thinking of walking through this every time he's going between Jerusalem and Jericho. And he's walking this path in the valley of the shadow of death. This is a little closer look. Here, this is going to be noisy, and because it was so windy up there, okay? I don't know how noisy I can turn it down. Yeah, very noisy. Let me turn it down a little bit. Explanation or I kind of get a sense of that valley all the way through there. And that was, like I said, that was the road between Jerusalem and Jericho. So here is Bethlehem. And upper right, you see where that line ends? That is Jericho. And then I'm going to climb up here. So if you can see this spot right here, that's St. George's Monastery. And there's just this little line of the mountains you can kind of see right here. So that's that valley, and that's where that road went. And they would take it from Jerusalem right here, or Bethlehem, Jerusalem, and they would take something like this. It's different now, but then they would cut across here through the valley of the shadow of death to reach Jericho.
Did you get to go in there?
I did not. They do have tours there, but it was one of the things that was not on our list. So it's quite a hike apparently, and you have to go over this kind of sketchy bridge to get there. But it would have been pretty incredible to have gone. But just another thing that if you can, it took us probably we were around Jericho, and it probably took us, maybe a couple miles from Jericho, and it took us probably half an hour to get there, just because you can only go certain ways, you're winding around, and you're on these narrow, windy roads with this huge tour bus, and just try not to think about it too much. And so it would have been a significant investment of time, I suppose, but maybe that'll be on my list for next time too. Do you have any other questions?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
When you were showing the mountains and you could see, it looked like black spots were all those holes for
Yeah.
caves. Because I thought maybe you had said something about I call them mountain goats.
Right.
Maybe across, and it looked like there was an animal or something clear at the top that was black.
I had looked for some. I didn't see any. There could have been. I'll have to go back and look too. But they were, at least most, if not all of those spots were caves. And and there's a lot of limestone there too, and so the water will wash out, through there and create caves. So they were, but most of them we're gonna see probably next week too. I think I'm probably gonna show you briefly Qumran. That's where they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it's just in this cave. It's not much of one, but from the outside, the whole I wouldn't have fit in there. But this was a place, a storehouse for scripture, and they had 4 clay pots of scripture in there. So this was, it looked like nothing, but it opened up. Couldn't go in there, but it opened up into enough of a cave to be a storehouse for them. And it also was on a cliff. Let me see if I go back far enough. It was on a cliff that was just as steep as some of these, like that right there. Those were very similar. Some of them actually, like this one here, that one actually has been, like someone's been in there, because it's actually kind of carved out with an arch on the window. So, who knows when or how big it is or why, but every once in a while you can see where someone has been in there. Maybe it was Bedouins, or maybe it was going back to, maybe David did it. I don't know. But it's just immense. And those things just go on and on and on. Any other questions?
How'd they get up here?
They were in way better shape than I am, I'll tell you that. Some of those shepherds, though, they were just so adept at getting where they needed to go. So also, okay, yeah, right. Those ibex, especially, they're quite the climbers too, and they can be on close to vertical. But also you can imagine too that over the last 2,000 years to Christ, another 1,500 years to David, you can kind of see all the rubble down here, right? So these cliffs would have looked a little different, and maybe there were paths, or maybe they were sloped differently, or who knows, but over time that has changed. But they were, if you can imagine, let's say David was in one of these right there, and Saul's down here. What's Saul gonna do? You're within a stone's throw, but David, you can't do anything about it. So that kind of makes sense to me, where I thought, how in the world would David be, oh, hey, Saul, I'm up here, without worrying about, now I'm going to die? Well, he had his exit, and it would have taken him how long to get up there? And they would have to figure out the route, and David already knew it, and he already had his way of escape, and knowing this area would have been a tremendous upper hand. Anyone else? They do harvest it, yes, they do harvest it, and you can buy Dead Sea salt, and they'll put the minerals, because it's not just salt either, there are other minerals as well, but they use it in all kinds of beauty products and just a lot of different things, so they do harvest it, but there's just so much there, and it's a big moneymaker. I think somewhere in my notes I have how much. It's billions with a B every year that they make. That industry is billions big from the Dead Sea minerals.
Where's that water from that spring?
So that would go to the Dead Sea, unless they are recovering it to use as fresh water. So if they're, you don't always know where they're getting it, but even if they aren't, it's probably just going to run along the ground and then go into those salt pockets, in the sinkholes, and it essentially will eventually go either to the Dead Sea or underground the Dead Sea, but anytime there were springs, and you could see where there were a couple I could see where you'd see some runoff or something maybe, or where there was some, all the way up and the coast of the Dead Sea, but not a lot. But that is part of what would feed it, and then the Jordan River would feed it from the north. Jordan flows into the Sea of Galilee, and the Jordan flows out of the Sea of Galilee, and it keeps going down till it hits the Dead Sea, and then it stops. So right now, the Jordan River is at 700 feet below sea level. It has to be up to 695 feet below sea level in order to flow into the Dead Sea. So a few weeks ago when I was there, the Jordan River wasn't actually flowing even into the Dead Sea at that time. It's just, that's again one of the problems when they're gathering all this fresh water for crops or for drinking. It means it's not flowing like it used to in there. And they're also producing fresh water for multiple countries in the area too from this. So that's part of why too. Anything else? This is a little different. There's not quite as much to see in a sense as some places we're going to look at. But for me, anyway, these were some really exciting ones to be able to see going back 3,500 years or so to the time of David and understanding this is what David saw as he's writing these Psalms. This is what he means by this, what he's referencing. And David's serving the same God that you and I are. You know, and his promises are still as true. And we can, you know, just like the conies can find refuge in the rocks, we find refuge in God. Just like the deer have to have every day, they have to have the drink from the spring. You and I need to be going to that spring and needing that same, desiring the same thing of our God, that we know Him. Okay, well, I'll pray, and then that'll give you a chance to close your eyes, and maybe Marshall can turn the lights on while we're closing our eyes and adjusting our eyes to the break. All right, but let's go pray and we'll look at it. Thank you, Lord, for helping us understand your word a little bit better, and maybe seeing some of it come alive, I hope, a little bit. I thank you that we know that whether it's 3,500 years ago or today, your word is true. May we rely on it and we desire you like David did. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, have a good night, y'all.